Good afternoon, viewers. Today we're going to investigate some of the other members of the Trump clown car, in particular, in
Trump
particular,
clown car.
in
You mean the
particular,
Trump clown bus that's bigger than a car?
in particular, we're going to look at Rubio, Marco Rubio. You may remember Marco Rubio when he gave one of the speeches after the summary or something after one of the State of the Union speeches, where he was slobbering over, you know, water. So he didn't make it too far then, but he's been, sucking up to Trump ever since he had a failed presidential bid. So now he's, secretary of something in a position to cause damage. Now
Isn't
the
he the first Latino or something to hold that position?
I don't even know why they call him a Latino. He was born in the U.S.
Well,
You
they
know,
gotta
yeah.
racialize them.
Well, yeah. What about the inclusion stuff? They should exclude him because he gets his job because he's the first Latino.
He's a
Trump should.
token Latino to try to say they're not racist party.
Well, in any event, he's part of the clown part of the clown cars, and his latest you have to really give the guy credit for being an asshole. The Cubans provide doctors to second world countries, especially around the Caribbean and down to Brazil. So they essentially export doctors. These places where the doctors are going, they need doctors. So they hire Cuban doctors. And you think, what could be wrong with that? Well, the State Department, a press statement from Marco Rubio, Secretary of State, said they took steps to revoke visas and impose visa restrictions on several government officials, Brazilian officials, former Pan American Health Organization officials, and their family members for complicity with the Cuban regime's labor export scheme. So,
Labor export scheme, helping
yes,
the world deal with crises and
medical services.
infections and medical services and vaccinations, probably what he don't like.
This is coming from a country that gives 5,000-pound bombs to blow tents up, and they're complaining about somebody sending out doctors. Now he says that these officials are responsible for or involved in abetting the Cuban regime's coercive labor export scheme that exploits Cuban medical workers through forced labor. Like, what a bunch of nonsense.
And he goes on and says in another article here that medical professionals are rented by other countries at high prices, and most of the revenue is kept by the Cuban authorities. He said it was a system that enriches Cuban officials and deprives the Cuban people of essential medical care. Now that's a crock of shit. First off, Cuba has a free education system, unlike the U.S. where you have to pay, $500,000, maybe $1 million to get your medical license. They are subsidized somewhat, and the government loans the doctors money that they have to pay back. But the Cuban government has one of the best healthcare systems as well. They offer free healthcare to any citizen, and they do have some of the top medical system education in probably North America for sure. They do through the black market and friendly countries like Canada get their hands on top medical equipment, even though U.S. and the Israelis sanction them and prevent them from doing such. People should be aware that Cuba pays for the education and offers these doctors to the problem areas of the world that need those services. And to help pay for the cost of education, I'm sure the Cuban government does charge a fee to those countries, but it will be a lot less expensive for a Cuban doctor than they would ever pay for a U.S. doctor. And that's what's pissing Rubio off, is the American Medical Association is a real powerful lobby group because there are a lot of wealthy doctors, and they're the ones putting pressure to say, hey, they should be paying tenfold the cost of medical care and having us U.S. doctors go into those conflict areas. That's my
Doc,
take on it.
no, the U.S. doctors aren't going anywhere near these places. But
Yeah,
to give it an
well,
idea of the numbers, in recent years, approximately 30,000 Cuban doctors have been working in 67 countries.
wow, that's a lot of humanitarian effort by Cuba. So why again is the world not allowed to do business with Cuba?
Well, if before we go past that, we should look at Rubio himself. His parents were born in Cuba, but they migrated or immigrated to the United States when Batista was in power, before Castro.
Oh, that's a
So
long time ago when it was
yes,
a corrupt government under U.S. control.
and which means that they can't complain that Castro threw out his parents.
Oh yeah,
So
that's a
so
big
that
one.
yeah, that argument's gone.
Yeah.
And the thing is, you got to wonder, like, why does the U.S. hate Cuba? And that goes back to Eisenhower when he tried to organize a military takeover in Cuba, which floundered as the Bay of Pigs under President Kennedy. Kennedy refused to provide any further air support. The Cubans won.
Yeah, well, the Cubans also in their revolt took back all the land and the businesses that the Americans were operating in Cuba, and that's what pissed off a lot of the Cubans that were making money off of these associations with U.S. business. So maybe Rubio's family had some business ties to the American entities that were seized under Castro that caused the sanctions to go on Cuba.
It doesn't appear so, because in his bio it says that his mother went back to Cuba for vacations on more than one occasion. It doesn't say that they were operating a business and they left before the revolution. So what could they have lost, basically? But there's an
Right.
interesting item that people don't talk about. The expropriated properties were offered cash. So if you
Yeah,
owned a
that's
casino
true.
in Havana, and what the Cuban government said is, we will pay you for expropriating your property. The value we will use is the value that you declared on your municipal taxes.
Yeah,
And
there you
and
go.
yeah,
I love that.
and it was a self-declared value. So
Yeah,
the U.S. brought
always
him.
undervalued it so they could rip the Cubans off, and the
Yes.
Cubans slapped them in the face with that, saying, "Hey, we'll
So
take
what
your value, and that's what we're paying you for." That was a good one.
so what they did is they brought in a law that said if you accepted any money from the Cuban government, you were an enemy of the country. The Helms, in other words, they would not let the Cubans pay
Self-government.
for the expropriated land.
Yeah. Well,
And
I
then
think I think it's appalling that the U.S. and Israel still have sanctions on Cuba. Those should be automatically lifted, and the rest of the world do trade with Cuba. And I mean, a lot of Canadians go there and holiday and ignore the sanctions by the U.S. But if that shows up on your passport going into the U.S., you have complications with entry into the U.S. And now with Trump in charge of this racist immigrant propaganda scam, if you had on your passport stamped that you went to Cuba, you would probably be thrown into alligator Alcatraz for a stay and then deported to whatever country would take you. And he would not necessarily send you back to Canada. So this is a real issue, and one of the reasons I tell Canadians, you're probably not smart traveling to the U.S. until there's some resolution to this corruption down there.
that dates back to 1960s. The Bay of Pigs, 1961. They landed a bunch of mercenaries on the shores. Took 3 days to get them defeated. They left. The Cubans decided that they had no choice because of the embargoes to cozy up to Russia. Russia provided missiles to the Cubans. the Americans freaked out, surrounded a naval blockade.
Well, we were
The,
close to World War III there, or a nuclear
yes,
blast, but
and then that
diplomacy won out in the end.
well, the diplomacy was that the Americans had to withdraw their missiles
Yeah.
from Turkey and Italy,
No.
and the Russians, Soviets at that time, withdrew their missiles from Cuba. So that was the result. But ever since then, Cuba has been under a UN sanctioned, essentially embargo, and
And
every
that's
year,
bullshit. That's total bullshit, and that should be removed.
if the UN was a democratic body, it would have been removed because an overwhelming number of countries vote to lift the embargo. The only countries that keep it in place are the US with its veto and Israel, which supports the US on any kind of nastiness anywhere in the world.
Well,
So,
in history, I think Obama slackened the rules of Cuba and Cubans coming to the U.S. and dealing, but from my understanding, he may not have voted to remove the sanctions at the UN.
yes. Yeah, so what he did is he allowed Americans to travel to Cuba, but he didn't lift the sanctions. And of course, when Trump got in, he removed that right.
But then again, under Obama, the Senate or House was controlled by Republicans, and they would have opposed that at all costs. So I think his hands were kind of tied. And immediately when Trump came into power, that was one of the first things he did was impose more sanctions and remove that right to the Cubans to deal with the U.S. And in so doing, it caused a problem. And I remember a CBC article on it, and I'd already done some research with a friend that's since passed. And we were researching how advanced the Cuban medical system was because we'd heard that they'd come up with a vaccine that helped in preventing lung cancer and in treating lung cancer. So we did a lot of research into that and found that there was some merits to this treatment. And at the time Obama opened it up for travel was because there were hundreds of victims of lung cancer that could afford the treatments to go to Havana and get treated, but they had to go every month to get their treatments, and it was really expensive. I think, if I recall, the article said it was like 10 grand a month, but the rich in the U.S. could afford it. I mean, they got to pay for medical care anyway, but this wasn't covered by their policy, so only the rich could get it. So they opened up the travel under Obama so the rich could get their treatments cheaper, and that in exchange, Cuba offered the U.S. to test their vaccine and to try to cut a deal to try to help people in the U.S. with these lung problems. Immediately upon Trump revoking that, the agreement was struck to allow the research of the lung cancer treatment that the Cubans had, is my understanding. But what I was trying to point out was that Cuba is and was always willing to assist people with their health issues. And I find it appalling that the greed of Rubio and the U.S. would say there's something wrong with Cuba offering assistance to these countries in need and then sanctioning the countries that are just offering valued services in medical aid to their citizens. How pathetic is that as a government to announce that you're against humanitarian aid to countries in need?
The economic damage is so high that it's hard for us to imagine. When I was down there, the power plant was waffly because it's aging and it's difficult to get parts. I
In
didn't
Cuba, in
yes,
Cuba, yes.
yeah, the beaches are beautiful, the people are beautiful. The people complain about the food. Canadians go down there and say, oh, the food isn't the best in the world. Well, you're eating better than the average Cuban. And I watched these pigs at the all-inclusive trough filling up their plates.
Yeah.
Oh, these little fat buggers filling up their plates to the top, the heap. and then walking away and going for dessert. It's shameful the way Canadians are. But
Well, I mean, Cuba has been given a bad deck of cards, and it's time that countries like Canada put pressure on the U.S. and Israel with sanctions for genocide. And part of the negotiations at the UN should be the immediate removal of sanctions against Cuba. And that is long overdue. And Cuba has shown that they provide as much humanitarian aid in the world as any other country of its size and population, if not more. They're a highly educated population. They have 98% literacy rate compared to the US, which has a low 80s literacy rate. So they're smarter and well educated, and probably that's why Trump don't like them, is because they are smarter than the average Trumpian. And that's something that we as a free world should be considering, that now that we know that the U.S. is an untrustworthy partner, maybe we should revoking some of its power. And one of those steps is to say that all sanctions on Cuba are immediately removed at the UN.
in 2019, the United States adopted even harsher measures of economic warfare against Cuba, denying them fuel and spare parts which are needed to keep Cuba's power supply and electric grid running.
And how
It
pathetic is that?
Well, and here's what Biden's administration claimed. They stated that the policy is to help and support the Cuban people.
No, they want to oppress the Cuban and Cuban people because their values are against the capitalist values of all the money goes to the rich. And they tell you how much you're paying for any services you can't afford it, die. And that's the American way. The Cuban way is to say all the people are of value, and you deserve a free education, and you deserve medical aid, and they provide it. And the U.S. tries to oppose that because they don't want their uneducated people ever waking up and being educated to demand that the wealthy pay their fair share and the peons receive their fair share for being the working class. So Cuba can show the U.S. a lot about how government should actually be run, and I think that's why Rubio and Trump want to oppress Cuba.
They want the resources, they want the area. But let's go further with what Rubio said. He said the officials that they sanctioned were responsible for aiding and abetting the Cuban regime's coercive labor export scheme, which exploits Cuban medical workers through forced labor. The scheme enriches the corrupt Cuban regime and deprives the Cuban people of essential medical care. As if he cares.
They're not being deprived of medical care. They have some of the best medical care, and it's all free.
Well, let me tell you something.
Education is free. So what's he full of? He's full of shit.
When I was down there, the translator, she had a university degree. For going to university for 4 years, she would teach school for 2 years, and that was in return for her education.
What a great system.
Her father had a heart attack. They couldn't even get aspirin because of the American embargo. That's how. And how is that, scheme?
No, they're
depriving the Cuban people.
They're the perpetrators of trying to ensure that the people in Cuba do not get any medical aid or medical resources from the free world. And that's no different than what they're doing in Gaza, where they're trying to oppress the people and force the people out of the land they want. The same is being applied, just a different method, and it just happens that Cuba was able to defend themselves better than the Palestinians in Gaza to being evicted. There's nothing Trump would like more than to take over Cuba and have his golf resorts and beachfront properties and everything, and he sees them as a weak, small country to begin with. So he's trying to put extra pressure on them, but we
The
know that's
beaches,
never going to happen.
the beaches are beautiful. The sand
That's what
goes
I
on
hear.
forever. The
It's
water
on
is
my
nice and
wish
warm, clear.
list to go there. I do
And
want to go there.
it's not that expensive. But you look at Rubio, if he discovers that one of the biggest sources of foreign currency in Cuba are Canadian tourists, you
Oh,
can be sure that he'll be sanctioning Canadians for going
well,
down
aren't
there.
we? Well, we're already being sanctioned. Maybe that's why we got a 10% increase from 25% to 35% on tariff
That
sanctions.
was Gaza. That was
Oh,
Gaza
that was
for
Gaza,
yeah,
but
for
Gaza did
recognizing the
not.
Palestinians.
Well, maybe we're going to get another 10-15% surcharge on our sanction when Rubio figures out that Canada does a lot to try to help Cuba. But I think we can do a hell of a lot more now that Trump has declared war on Canada, and I think we should be removing all sanctions against Cuba and supplying them with whatever they need as well, lest they be the next Gaza under the Trump military regime.
193 members of the Assembly, the UN Assembly, adopted the resolution that's gone out every year for decades to lift the U.S. embargo on Cuba. 193 countries to 2.
Wow.
And the 2 countries are obvious outliers. One thinks he's the bully of the world, and the other one runs the bully of the world. It's unfortunate that this kind of stuff.
I mean,
187 in favor and 2 against, 1
well,
abstention.
that should, tell the world right there that there should be no veto power. The majority rule. If it's a democratic board, then it's a democracy. The UN should be a democracy and represent democracy. When the majority says remove the sanctions, the majority wins. And how can you expect countries in the world to ever believe that there is such a thing as true democracy when the world body, the UN, does not even have a democracy within its structure? Maybe we should do another podcast on UN structure, but later on. It's not something I'm willing to go into right at this time. But that shows you how corrupt the actual system is without having the democratic process as being the forefront of trying to help the world. And the UN should be ashamed that they're not implementing true democracy within their system of rule.
Now, you can tell, too, that the press has fallen in line with the propaganda because some of them, like Yahoo News Canada, calls this the Cuban medical scheme.
Yeah, what scheme? Like bullshit. And that's what people got to realize, this freedom of the press. No, you do not have the right to lie and manipulate and propagandize. Journalism has to be about the truth, and anybody manipulating or lying or trying to deceive should be charged. And those are what we can do through the UN, and Canada can have laws where if you're professing to be a journalist and you intentionally lie or mislead, you should be charged and thrown your ass in jail until you learn the difference between truth and fiction. That's something that has to be done, because this propaganda war of misleading is causing problems all around the world, and it's emboldening the rich and the powerful to get their own way.
Here, Rubio's worried about depriving Cubans of medical care because they have so many doctors working, in foreign countries.
Yeah, well.
At the same time here, the Israeli military has destroyed more than 300 homes in Gaza and killed over 100 Palestinians in the last day.
Well, and they bombed hospitals, and how many doctors have lost their lives and nurses have lost their lives in Gaza. And he's bitching about doctors going over to other countries to aid in crisis.
It's a clown car. It's
not
horrible.
A clown car. In the U.S., it's a clown train. And it's a train running down a track that hopefully somebody removes the bridge at one end, because its clown train is just running havoc and across all the U.S., and it's affecting all the world.
They're talking about sending the Palestinians to South Sudan, which
I
is
heard that.
in the middle of a civil war.
Yeah, well, what are you going to do? That send them to where you know they're just going to be executed and give them, a bullet for each Palestinian as a free compensation. They probably didn't include that in their news release, but I can guarantee the U.S. and the Israelis will be providing the bullets to take care of their problem.
On
And that's
Wednesday,
pathetic. That is flaunting international law, and we need the UN to start being a democratic process where the majority rule, not the minority that have veto power. That should be pulled immediately. In September, when they meet, that should be the first thing on the docket, is that the UN has got a set of balls and they are revoking all veto power, and it is a democratic process where the majority rule on the votes, period. And that has to be done, and that should be what Macron and Starmer should be doing in the UK and France, is pushing an agenda that democracy rules at the UN, and that would send a message loud and clear to the bullies of the world.
they would just withdraw. But
Well, it don't matter, withdraw, because the UN now has the power to create economic engines all around the world and exclude countries that think they are the economic engines. And that could change the world politics significantly over the next 20 to 25 years.
So Rubio's worried about Cuban doctors working in foreign countries taking away from Cubans. But here's on Wednesday, a group of UN experts accused Israel of carrying out medicide. They actually have a name for this now.
Oh yeah,
by destroying Gaza's healthcare system while targeting healthcare workers. 37 people seeking food and aid were killed on Wednesday, including 16 at an aid point in another town. Across the border, truck drivers say Israel is continuing to block deliveries of food.
Yeah,
you would think Rubio, who's so concerned about forced labor of medical doctors on Cuba, would be looking at bigger problems like Israel and maybe putting some sanctions.
Secretary of State.
Where are the sanctions on Israel? Like
Wow.
how can you assassinate journalists and kill women and children and starve people to death and have no sanctions? Yet you can sanction a country that hires doctors from Cuba.
Yeah,
The proportionality is just right out to lunch.
Yeah, and as Secretary of State, he should be trying to do the right things instead of catering to the Trumpians. That's pathetic. I don't even, how can you even wake up in the morning and look yourself in the mirror and say, I'm a good person? You're just a piece of shit, and the mirror would crack if you said anything else. So I really am appalled that this has even hit the news, number one, and I don't understand what Rubio is thinking rationally. Like, he would rather see the people get sick and die than have doctors. And Cuba is not known to be anything but lack of medicine that U.S. could supply them for the health care of their people. So, yeah, this is hypocritical. It shows the lack of ethics, the lack of morals, the lack of values. The U.S. and Rubio have been weighed, measured, and found really wanting, is the old saying, and they should be ashamed of themselves.
Well, after worrying about the healthcare situation in Cuba, the U.S. has cut back its foreign aid. So
They've
it's cut
also
off.
cut back on Medicaid in the U.S. itself.
Yeah, as if they're worried about forced labor of doctors and worried about Cubans not having enough doctors at home to properly serve their community. Here they are cutting their own residents off. They're it's unreal. They're cutting foreign aid to these countries that depended on these feeding
They're
and
cutting
medical.
funding to universities in the U.S. so they can train doctors. They're cutting their health care services. They're making it so that insurance companies are gouging people to get health care coverage. I don't
They
see
they
where they can point the finger at Cuba and have, wagging their finger at Cuba while they're, sticking it to the average American right up their wazoo on legal bills and for covering health care costs. How many people go bankrupt because they can't pay their health care costs? A lot of
in,
people in the U.S.
in January, the Senate approved cutting $8 billion out of an already approved foreign aid spending.
Wow.
Eight
How many
and
people and how many lives are affected by that? I
well,
mean,
the
that's got to see the death of many people. It's like cutting
thirty
the food
thousand
supply
30
and having
30,000
it rot on the.
30,000 hungry kids, Corey.
Yeah, I
30
know.
30,000 hungry kids.
And Trump is trying to seek a Nobel Peace Prize for killing kids around the world and aiding and abetting genocide. And holy shit, folks! If he was ever, he shouldn't even have his name on the application for Nobel Peace Prize when you're cutting $8 billion in aid to help the impoverished people of the world and save lives. That's meaningful, and that's a lot of aid that has been stopped for no reason other than they don't like the people that the money and aid is going to, which is a racist foundation of that government, is all I see. I could be wrong, but what's your opinion?
Well, they cut 400 million out of the HIV prevention program.
Yeah.
Like they're withdrawing. They've cut 1.1 billion out of the Corporation of Public Broadcasting because
Oh, they don't want media, man. They
no.
don't want any news. You can
So
guarantee that's cut.
so so the billionaires can have a tax cut. They've done all of this to poor defenseless people. Now, if you're a billionaire, what else can you buy? Like after you have one or two, three or four, 5 or 6 billion, what else is there out there that you need?
Yeah,
Like
it's just
it's
subjugation. The money subjugates people, and they like the fact that they can do anything. And I guess it goes back to a statement Trump once said that any wealthy person can grab any woman by the pussy, and basically he's saying that money depicts whatever you want to do because you can buy the courts, you can buy the judges, you can buy the people off. Money talks, and that is the ultimate power, and that's all the billionaires are doing by shirking their responsibility for their local communities and countries by hoarding the funds. That's all. It's not trickle down economics, it's trickle up economics, and you're beneath them for a reason because you're not as good a person as them, and they deserve it, you do not, and shut up and go to work and make them more money. That's called a peon. You get pissed on if you don't stand up. And it's regressed since the 60s revolutions, and it's not getting better. The unions are getting weaker, and the people are getting less and less, and the wealthy are owning and running everything.
there's a lady in New Zealand, a member of Parliament, who got ejected because she called her fellow MPs spineless because they wouldn't take any action. And you got
Well,
to
they
see
are
that.
spineless, aren't they? If you don't take action, you're spineless.
Well, you got to see the tape of the grumpy speaker when he throws her out, demanding an apology. An apology. She says, "No, I'm not going to
Well,
apologize."
well, that's like Smith demanding an apology for the town of Jasper after compiling all the complaints and reports on how to efficiently deal with a potential fire in the future, blamed the Alberta government for interfering with the firefighting and causing more damages. And Smith is stomping and ranting that she should be given an apology. The only apology some moron like that should be given is she should be booted out of the government here because she's definitely hurting Alberta's reputation by such stupidity, and that's why she's called MAGA Smith. So. Sorry about ranting and going off topic, but that's, you got to have a spine nowadays because these criminal people are starting to learn to use propaganda, own the media, and shoving their hidden agendas down your throat. So you're going to have to get a set of kahunas and stand up. I like that Newsom down in California. He's finally got the right formula. He's every day on top of Trump and using Trump's own marketing campaign strategies of start slandering Trump and being one step ahead of Trump. And I think that's going to be very effective for him in the state of California, which we'll be seeing more of that, and it'll be pretty interesting the effects it has on the MAGA uneducated. I think it's going to have some huge impact because it's flaunting and showing how stupid Trump is at the same time putting roadblocks up to Trump. Newsom, congratulations. I don't know if you read on that, but anyway, have we covered the topic of stupid out of the U.S. on healthcare issues?
The hypocrisy is if people in the U.S. can't. Well, I know why they don't know about it, because they're all watching their belly button to see what Trump's going to do to Putin, and you know what's going to happen there? Nothing.
Well, actually, it is. There's a reason Trump wants to meet Putin in private. Trump has to adhere to some of his issues that Putin has to deal with Trump, and Trump has to make sure that if something comes out from Maxwell or the Epstein files where he's charged for pedophilia, if there's evidence that he committed pedophilia and sexual assault on minors, young girls, then he has to cut a deal with Putin in private that he can seek asylum to the USSR or Russia, whatever you want to call it under Putin. And that's more likely why he's meeting in private with Putin, is because Trump knows that if the documents are released, there might be some incriminating evidence that he is also not protected by that agreement for non-prosecution that was given Epstein for his co-conspirators. And if that's the case, he wants to meet in private with Putin to cover his ass and an exit strategy. And that's the only reason you do that. There's no rational thought to that unless you're Putin's puppet and a compromised agent. A compromised agent has to do things in a deceiving manner, and that is why they're meeting up in, up there in Alaska.
Alaska.
So, yeah. So it's not a good scenario. We should do a hot take on that, but that's another episode, I guess. So we done talking about Rubio and his corrupt policy?
Oh yeah.
Okay. Well, comment, share, and it's free to subscribe. Hit the subscribe button and help us do more research on other events that affect you. And just because we're in Canada does not mean world affairs do not affect us directly and impact our lives at home, folks. It does. Even the fact that Cuba is shipping doctors out to help other countries around the world, that helps Canada free up doctors to offer services in other areas as well. So it's a world affair to make sure that we are good world citizens. And Cuba, thank you for being a good world citizen. And fuck you, U.S., for even thinking that Cuba shouldn't be sending doctors to countries of the world. And maybe we should be sanctioning U.S. instead of Cuba. Anything you'd like to add to that, Claude?
No.
Okay.
Good afternoon.
Okay, take care.
Bye.